Hello, I'm Simon Richardson from the Manx Radio Newsroom. A new report says the Isle of Man ferry terminal project had a rushed delivery timescale, was inadequately planned and has proved hopelessly ambitious in its initial budgeting. That's the verdict of a Public Accounts Committee investigation into the affair. I've been talking to the committee chair, Speaker of the House of Keys, Juan Watterson.
It's definitely a difficult read, I think, for the department and for government. I think it exposes some areas of weakness, but I think it also does, in fairness, recognise that this is a complex scheme. It's an unprecedented scheme in terms of what the government's tried to do. It got some things right, it got other things wrong, but the things that have gone wrong have cost a significant amount of money to the taxpayer, but not all of it was entirely within government's control.
You say rushed delivery timescale, inadequately planned and hopelessly ambitious in its initial budgeting.
Project that was due to be costing £18 million has ended up costing 4 times that. So that's a significant amount of optimism bias there in terms of what it was expected to cost back at the time. There have been unforeseen elements to that as well, but it was something that seemed to be very rushed. It seemed to be a continually burning platform for them, and the project seemed to move at a pace that it was faster than they could plan for.
It is a comprehensive report which examines the timeline of events closely. A summary of your findings would suggest a lack of proper scrutiny and maybe a failure to include specialist advisors to assist in project risk management.
Certainly the department realised that this was a scheme that was bigger than and different from ones that it was used to, and it did take on specialist advice. I wouldn't say that was universally successful in terms of getting all the advice that they needed at the right time. For example, there was around the lease, about the time that they took on the lease, whether they fully knew all of what they were getting. They certainly hadn't done all the surveys that you'd expect would have been done. There was a big spoil heap on the site that's prevented from meaningful groundwork being done. They hadn't done the due diligence to know that actually what was discovered later to be 300 voids under the site, a significant amount of archaeology, which again didn't seem to have been investigated, despite that area of Liverpool being well documented in terms of its archaeology. So there were things that were most definitely missed in the rush. I think it's probably be our conclusion on this.
So a lot of things missed in if you like, the pre-contract phase, but also the report points to a flawed tender process.
Yeah, one of the conclusions that's come out of this is that the procurement process that means that services are procured on the basis that at least 50% of the weighting has to be cost is just flawed. And the way that the significant amount of weight that is given to cost in a contract isn't necessarily always appropriate. And that is something that we think really does need a cold, hard look at. It's out of kilter with some of the best practice in the UK. If you look at their Green Book for capital projects, it is diversion from that. So I think that we are potentially sometimes penny wise and pound foolish when looking for the right advice and looking for some of the big procurement ticket items that the Isle of Man government buys.
Where does the blame lie for so many errors? Is it a collective responsibility, or could it be pointed at specific individuals?
I don't think that the Public Accounts Committee finds merit in seeking to apportion blame for these sorts of things. I think it's always got to be about trying to give a fair assessment of what was reasonably knowable at the time, where that's fallen short, and also to explain some of the story about where costs have changed during the life of the project, and the story that is told in that report is very much about things that were completely unforeseeable. The 4 million that was added to the budget by COVID, I don't think anyone would reasonably expected that. And sometimes it's a case of where things have dropped through the cracks. That's had very expensive ramifications. So when the lease was signed and it didn't include the sea wall, that meant that instead of spending £800,000 on scour protection, we've ended up spending £10 million on scour protection. Now, is that value for money? It's hard to say, because the £800,000 was an acceptable one. It was a sacrificial thing that would be replaced every few years. But because it was the scour protection is something that could then be insisted on by the landowner, we've ended up with a gold standard. Now, that gold standard should last 50 years. And if it does, then we will have had value for money. But at this time, what that means is that cost has really been front-loaded, and that's £9 million into a project that would have been done differently had it been entirely within the grasp of government. So blame's not necessarily a constructive term to use, but it's definitely something that we need to look at the story in the round. A very complicated story, a story that's taken 2 years for us to tell, to distill down to 70 pages of report and try and make sense of after sifting through thousands of pages of evidence. It is complex, but there is an interesting, if complex, story to tell in this.
And are you confident that in the wake of your committee's report, any report of failures on this scale in future can be avoided?
One of the things that we're recommending to Tynwald is that for larger projects, at least, Tynwald are updated twice a year on it, because I think one of the things that has surprised the taxpayer and Tynwald members is that the price of this project has jumped so significantly in relatively short space of time, and that has been shocking for all of us. Perhaps these conversations, the public, the taxpayer and politicians could have been brought a little bit more on that journey, have been better informed, and then been able to make judgment calls as to whether this was really worth putting more money into or not. I think probably ultimately we would still be where we are today, but I think it's important that people do understand these issues as we go along, rather than just being saddled with the bill at the end of it, not even at the end of it, for just mounting costs with no certainty as to what it's going to cost finally. And I think that's been a real part of the anger in the politics around this, that just never quite knowing where it's all going to end, when it's going to end, and how much ultimately it's going to cost.
And what happens now? The report will be laid before Tynwald. Would that be for discussion?
Yes, the report is published now, and it will be debated in Tynwald in February, an appropriate time, because that will be the budget sitting of Tynwald. So a good opportunity for Tynwald members there to have their say on the recommendations that we've produced, which hopefully will make a more robust capital procurement procedure going forward.
Thank you for making it to the end of the Little Manx Radio newscast. You are obviously someone with exquisite taste. May I politely suggest you might want to subscribe to this and a wide range of Manx Radio podcasts at your favourite podcast provider, so our best bits will magically appear on your smartphone. Thank you.